of Hong Kong, but I think it's worth just saying from the outset that we should see the situation in Hong Kong in the wider context of the situation in China, which really is going through the worst crackdown on human rights, certainly since the Tiananmen massacre of 1989, and in some respects, even since the Cultural Revolution. And I'm deeply involved in other aspects of the China situation, the situation of the Uyghurs, Falun Gong and organ harvesting, as Regina has mentioned, the increasing repression of Christians, of lawyers, of bloggers, of any form of dissent. So I'm happy when we come to a Q&A to, if there are questions on those other aspects, I'm happy to come to those. And it's worth also mentioning that I've worked for many years in other parts of the region as well on mass atrocities in Myanmar, on crimes against humanity in North Korea, and other issues in the region. Obviously, I'm not going to cover all of that. That's just a bit of context. I thought I'd maybe just go back in time a little bit with Hong Kong, just to recap what has happened, not just over the last few years, but actually going further back, just to put the current crisis in Hong Kong in some historical context. Many of you will know this already, but in 1984, Margaret Thatcher, as the British Prime Minister, negotiated with Deng Xiaoping, although technically she actually signed with the Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is an international treaty. It's lodged at the United Nations, and it's valid from the time of the handover of Hong Kong in 1997 for the first 50 years after the handover until 2047. And the Joint Declaration guarantees the preservation of Hong Kong's basic freedoms, the rule of law, way of life, and a high degree of autonomy for at least the first 50 years from the time of Hong Kong's handover. And it was really, I think, to Deng Xiaoping's credit that he came up with the concept of one country, two systems, the recognition that Hong Kong would be handed over to Chinese sovereignty. And really, Britain had very little choice in that. Technically, we had a lease on Kowloon and the new territories lasting for 99 years, which meant that had to be handed over legally to China in 1997. Technically, theoretically, we could have, if we wanted to, held on to Hong Kong Island, but that wasn't practical at all. I mean, if we tried that, China almost certainly would have tried to seize it, or at least made the survival of Hong Kong Island very difficult, because Hong Kong Island is dependent on Kowloon and the new territories for pretty much everything. So it wasn't a possibility to try to refuse to hand Hong Kong over, and therefore negotiating this concept of one country, two systems was, at least in theory, the best possible option. In 1997, Hong Kong was handed over to China as planned and agreed. In the last few years before the handover, the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, tried, admittedly it was very late in the day, but he did try to put in place some democratic reforms and further protections of human rights to further guarantee Hong Kong's way of life, even above what was guaranteed in the Joint Declaration. And just a bit of personal context, I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover, from 1997 to 2002. It was my first job after university, and it was where I began my career. I began as a journalist working for a number of publications in Hong Kong. But I also, in my spare time, began my human rights work in Hong Kong, getting involved in other issues in the region, particularly East Timor and Myanmar, from Hong Kong. And really at that time, Hong Kong was not just the international financial hub that it's been for so long, but also a real hub in the region for both the international media, and for civil society and human rights groups. It was a place where I and others could use the freedoms that existed in Hong Kong to speak about and defend and promote the human rights of others in the region. It was never a place that I anticipated actually having to get involved in defending its own human rights and freedoms. I left Hong Kong in 2002, and generally speaking, I somewhat lost touch with the political and human rights situation in Hong Kong between the time I left in 2002 and the umbrella movement in 2014, because during those years, by and large, with some exceptions, one country, two systems was working pretty well. Hong Kong's basic freedoms were intact. Press freedom was strong. Other basic freedoms were there, and I was focused on other issues in the region and didn't have too much cause for concern during those years. The only issue that arose was a year after I left Hong Kong in 2003, when the government tried to introduce Article 23 of Hong Kong's Basic Law. The Basic Law is basically Hong Kong's mini constitution, and it does contain an article, Article 23, that requires the government to introduce a national security law. And so it was always known that at some stage a national security law would be introduced. The government tried to bring that forward in 2003, and it provoked huge demonstrations, not quite on the scale of demonstrations we've seen more recently, but nevertheless very significant demonstrations. And at that time, the Hong Kong government backed down and listened to the people and withdrew the proposed national security law under Article 23. But really, apart from that, there were some issues around changes to the national curriculum, which sparked a student movement. It was, you may be familiar with Joshua Wong, who's become one of the figureheads of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. He began his activist life as a young teenager, protesting against attempts to introduce so-called patriotic education, basically pro the Chinese regime education in the school curriculum. But apart from those issues, by and large, one country, two systems was intact. But in 2014, you may recall what became known as the Umbrella Movement. And that really was a turning point for Hong Kong. It was certainly a turning point for me, because I realized when I saw thousands and thousands of people peacefully protesting 6 years ago in what began as a movement known as Occupy Central with Love and Peace, a good concept, and it then morphed into becoming known as the Umbrella Movement, simply because many people held yellow umbrellas, which became the symbol of the movement. That caught my attention, and I realized something very significant was happening, something very significant was changing in Hong Kong, and I started to re-engage in advocacy for Hong Kong, initially in a purely personal capacity, writing about it, hosting Hong Kong activists when they visited London, arranging meetings for them with people in Parliament. And essentially that then led me to realize that there was a need for an advocacy organization for Hong Kong, because I found that the levels of awareness at that time, it's changed now, but back in 2014, 2015, 2016, the levels of awareness and understanding about the issues in Hong Kong were very low, and I felt there was a need for an organization. And so in 2017, I founded Hong Kong Watch, and I'm just in the process of going full-time with that this month. But the Umbrella Movement was sparked by a desire for universal suffrage, for full democracy. The current political system in Hong Kong is that the district council seats are all directly elected. The Legislative Council is partially elected by popular vote, and partially elected by an electoral college that is basically packed with pretty much pro-Beijing professional bodies, representatives from the different sectors, the financial sector, the banking sector, the legal sector, and other industrial and business sectors. And then the chief executive of Hong Kong, who's the equivalent of the mayor or the governor, is elected by an electoral college, but that electoral college again is packed by pro-Beijing representatives, and essentially the chief executive is a Beijing appointee. But the basic law, which, as I mentioned earlier, does require the introduction of a national security law, also requires in Article 45, or at least states, these words, and it's vaguely worded, but nevertheless it's there. It says the ultimate aim is that the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. So in other words, that pledge for universal suffrage for the election of Hong Kong's chief executive is there, although with no time frame attached to it. And so what happened in 2014 was a movement developed demanding that that be implemented and that they have universal suffrage direct elections for the chief executive. Beijing responded by initially saying, okay, we will consider doing that, but we will choose the candidates. So in other words, the candidates would all be picked by Beijing and then people could vote on them. And quite understandably, the democracy movement that had grown up over previous years said, well, that's not democracy if the Chinese regime is choosing all the candidates and packing the slate. As Martin Lee, the father figure of Hong Kong's democracy movement, put it, what's the difference between a rotten apple, a rotten orange, and a rotten banana? And so these protests continued for a total of 79 days. And those protests in 2014 were entirely and admirably peaceful. In fact, not just peaceful, but unbelievably orderly. There were amazing scenes of students and school kids who were protesting at times, but then doing their homework and their essays for school in the tents that they were in as part of the Occupy movement. It's not very often that you see protesters sitting in their tents doing their homework. And so that, I think, was a very inspiring and moving episode. But of course, it didn't achieve its objectives. And since then, it seems that Xi Jinping and the regime in Beijing have been determined to do everything possible to crack down on dissent in Hong Kong, initially subtly and step by step, and then this year much more dramatically. So to give you an example, some examples of some of the things that have happened since the Umbrella Movement, in 2015, a number of Hong Kong-based booksellers who ran a bookshop publishing and selling books that were critical of the Chinese leadership, some books that contained sort of rumors about Chinese leaders' private lives. And they had run this bookshop for quite some years, entirely legally in Hong Kong's context, although obviously the books were books that would not be permitted in the mainland. They, one by one, disappeared in 2015, and it emerged that in a variety of ways they had been abducted into the mainland, some of them directly from Hong Kong, although in the case of Gui Minhai, who was a Hong Kong resident, but a Swedish national, Chinese-born, but Swedish citizen, was abducted from his holiday home in Thailand. So you have a foreign national being abducted by Chinese agents from a third country, and he's now, earlier this year, been sentenced to 10 years in jail. So the bookseller's case was a major turning point and a very worrying sign of things to come. In 2017, we saw the disqualification of a number of pro-democracy legislators who'd been elected to the legislature the previous September in 2016. The most notable of those was Nathan Law, who has subsequently become the most high-profile activist to flee Hong Kong just a couple of years ago, and I know him very well and work very closely with him. But he was disqualified. He was elected as the youngest legislator in September 2016 at the age of 23. And he was disqualified a few months later because he was accused of not taking his oath of office properly, even though the president of the Legislative Council chamber had ruled that actually his oath was in order. But a court overturned that and ruled that he had not taken his oath properly. What he'd done was taken his oath in full and then quoted some words from Mahatma Gandhi after taking his oath, but while still at the podium where he took the oath. And for that reason, he was disqualified. There were others who had perhaps gone somewhat more radical in their attitude to the oath, and they were also disqualified. But certainly in the case of Nathan Law, he was simply disqualified for quoting Mahatma Gandhi. And that led then to a continuous process of the disqualification of other legislators and of candidates for election. One of the most prominent was the activist Agnes Chow, who was planning to stand for a by-election in 2018, and she was disqualified from even being a candidate on the grounds that although she didn't advocate Hong Kong independence, the authorities ruled that they were not convinced that she was sincere in not advocating Hong Kong independence. And so this concept of political screening, the screening of candidates for their political views before they're even allowed to be candidates, grew. Turning back to 2017, we saw the imprisonment of the first of what I would say has been now a long run of political prisoners in Hong Kong. The imprisonment of Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, who I just mentioned, and Alex Chow, who were sentenced between them to 6, 7, and 8 months in jail for their role in the umbrella movement of 2014. And what was significant about their case was that they had already been given by a lower court a penalty of community service for some of the things they'd done during the Occupy movement. And yet the legal system overturned that and imposed prison sentences on them effectively retrospectively. That provoked a significant international outcry. A letter by at least 25 prominent politicians and diplomats and experts from around the world was issued. A letter by at least 12 very senior lawyers, including the former Lord Chancellor in the UK, Lord Faulkner, QCs like Sir Geoffrey Nice, Sir Desmond de Silva, and others signed on to this letter, highlighting their concerns with the way Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, and Alex Chow had been treated. And that had some effect at that time. And in fact, they were then released before their sentences were complete on the decision of the Court of Appeal. So at that time, there was some hope, despite its problems, that the independence of the judiciary was still somewhat intact. In 2018, we saw the issue of the introduction of the concept of what became known as co-location, the imposition of mainland Chinese law at the high-speed rail link on Hong Kong soil that was the terminus for the high-speed rail link to the mainland. And what this law and this concept did was to impose mainland Chinese law in that rail terminus on Hong Kong soil. So in other words, mainland Chinese law on Hong Kong soil, in direct contravention of the whole principle of one country, two systems. And one of the most prominent victims of that law was a local Hong Kong employee of the British consulate in Hong Kong, Simon Cheng, who in August 2019 was returning to Hong Kong from a business trip to the mainland. He was picked up upon entry to Hong Kong from the mainland, but taken back into the mainland by Chinese security personnel and was subjected to terrible torture in detention in mainland China for a number of weeks. Eventually he was released, and he's now in the UK and has told his story publicly. But the real issue that has led to the situation where Hong Kong is today, and which took the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms to an entirely new level, was the introduction early in 2019 by Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, of an extradition bill that would allow for the extradition of people from Hong Kong into mainland China. And this was sparked by a case of a murder of by a Hong Kong person in Taiwan, a murder of his girlfriend, which very understandably Carrie Lam and others were deeply, rightly concerned about and wanted justice to be done. But because Hong Kong couldn't have an extradition arrangement with Taiwan because of the whole status of Taiwan, they decided to introduce an extradition bill that would allow for the extradition between Hong Kong and mainland China. And what this bill did was to destroy the firewall that had been put in place very deliberately before the handover to protect Hong Kong's rule of law and judicial independence. The Hong Kong government said they were closing a loophole, but British government officials who were involved in establishing this, the fact that there was no extradition arrangement, said absolutely it wasn't a loophole, it wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate firewall to protect one country, two systems, and by introducing this bill, the Hong Kong government was destroying that firewall. What was significant, though, was that it was met almost immediately by a unified outcry from different sectors of society who very rarely are united. Almost the entire legal profession opposed the extradition bill. The business community, which is never normally on the same side as the pro-democracy movement, were outspoken. Many chambers of commerce spoke out. And then the international community, the US Secretary of State, the British and Canadian foreign ministers, the European Union issued a démarche. And despite all of that, the Hong Kong government refused to listen. And then 1 million people took to the streets in June 2019 peacefully. 1 million people marched with the most extraordinary discipline and totally peacefully. 1 million out of a population of 7 million, so a very significant proportion of the population. And again, the Hong Kong government didn't listen. So the following weekend, 2 million marched, even though with the march of 1 million, although the marches had been peaceful, the police had responded with disproportionate violence, had used tear gas and batons and pepper spray, even as the demonstration was peaceful. But despite the police brutality, 2 million turned out the following week. Eventually, Carrie Lam announced she would suspend the bill, but by that point, suspension was nowhere near enough, and so the demonstrations continued. And tragically, a small minority of demonstrators turned violent. I don't condone the use of violence by the protesters, and some of their conduct is not at all defensible. But I would say that we also need to understand why they resorted to extreme action. And I think they did so for two reasons. Firstly, that they were provoked by the Hong Kong police. The Hong Kong police responded to peaceful protests with violence and brutality, and so protesters responded to that. But secondly, they turned to extreme action because they saw that the government was simply refusing to listen to the legal sector, the business sector, the international community, and a significant proportion of the population that marched peacefully. And so those protests continued more or less until the end of last year, with regular violence, some violence by the protesters, but also regular, disproportionate, indiscriminate, and widespread and shocking brutality by the Hong Kong police. And there have been something like 10,000 protesters who've been arrested, but not a single police officer has been held to account at all for any of their violent actions. The protests paused in the first part of this year, primarily because of the COVID-19 pandemic, where it just wasn't possible for people to protest. But the authorities, instead of using that breathing space to perhaps begin a dialogue or to seek some constructive way forward, and also instead of, I should have mentioned that in November last year, in the midst of the protests, the district council elections were held, and the pro-democracy movement won an overwhelming majority in those district council elections, which again, the government could have responded to constructively. The election of district councillors could have provided the government with a dialogue partner to seek a way forward and to try to find some compromise for political reform, but they didn't. And then things escalated. I mean, the regime escalated things throughout this year. On April the 18th this year, we saw the authorities arrest not young protesters who'd been throwing Molotov cocktails, but 15 of the most distinguished, internationally respected, experienced, moderate, entirely peaceful pro-democracy leaders, people like Martin Lee, the father of the democracy movement, who's in his early 80s, Jimmy Lai, the owner of the pro-democracy newspaper, the Apple Daily, the barrister Margaret Ng, who's in her 70s and who is a highly respected lawyer. 15 people like that were arrested on the 18th of April. And then finally, I'll draw towards a close, at the end of May this year, Beijing stunned everyone by announcing out of the blue that it was going to impose a national security law through the National People's Congress, the Chinese Communist Party's body in Beijing. And not only was it going to do that, but it was going to fast track that legislation with no consultation, debate, or even information over the course of a month. As I said at the beginning, we always knew that a national security law would come at some point, and that it is mandated by the Basic Law. And of course, having a national security law in and of itself is not necessarily a bad or a wrong thing. You know, most countries have security laws, and the issue is not whether it should have one. The issue is what that law does, how it's implemented, and what the context of its implementation is. And if, first of all, if the article in the Basic Law that promises universal suffrage had been delivered, and Hong Kong had an accountable, democratic, transparent system of governance, then a security law would be less of a problem. And secondly, if the security law had been introduced in the way that the Basic Law required it to be introduced, which is through Hong Kong's legislature and open to the normal course of debate and scrutiny and amendment, then it might be a somewhat different matter. But being fast-tracked through a totally rubber-stamp, unaccountable National People's Congress, with the the content of the law being unknown to anybody other than those in the National People's Congress was astonishing. According to reports, it seems that even the Hong Kong government, even Carrie Lam herself, didn't know what was in the law until it was published after moments after it had been approved by the National People's Congress, and that was only a matter of a few hours before it became effective, and it came into force on the 1st of July. The law basically shatters whatever remained of Hong Kong's freedoms and fundamental human rights. It also flagrantly breaches the Sino-British Joint Declaration and Hong Kong's own basic law. And it basically provides for the criminalization of actions under four categories: secession, subversion, collusion with foreign political entities, and terrorism. And the problem is the lack of definition of these terms. I mean, of course, nobody or very few people would oppose a law that deals with genuine terrorism. But these terms are very poorly defined. So any discussion of even the idea of self-determination or independence is now a serious criminal offense. I remember last year, before this law came in, a party in Hong Kong that was pro-Hong Kong independence, the Hong Kong National Party, was banned. And I tweeted a comment saying that I myself don't advocate Hong Kong independence. I wanted to make one country, two systems work, but I certainly defend the freedom of expression for people to discuss independence. And somebody tweeted me back saying, and I know this event is taking place in Stirling, and probably many participants are from Scotland. Somebody tweeted me saying, well, how would you feel if advocates of Scottish independence were allowed to run for your parliament? And I replied saying that they're the third largest party in our parliament and they're in government in Scotland. And I think this person was somewhat surprised. But anyway, the criminalization of even discussion of secession. Secondly, the term subversion, which again is very ill-defined and can be applied to pretty much any form of dissent or criticism of the Chinese Communist Party or the Hong Kong government. Thirdly, this concept of collusion with foreign entities, which in effect means that people who used to talk to me, and some brave people who still do, but they are now, as of the 1st of July, by talking to someone like me, by talking to a foreign parliamentarian, a foreign journalist, any foreign entity that is deemed to be critical of the Chinese regime, by even talking to us, they're committing an offense. Article 38 of the National Security Law is one of the most bizarre parts of the law, in that it applies the principle of extraterritoriality. And so it basically says that this law does not just apply to Hong Kong citizens in Hong Kong. It applies to anyone, whether or not they're a Hong Kong citizen, anywhere in the world, whether or not what they're doing is within Hong Kong borders. So I have to tell you that actually what I'm saying to you today, and even your participation in this webinar right now, theoretically is in breach of Hong Kong's national security law. I'm in breach of Hong Kong's national security law pretty much every day, several times a day since the 1st of July, because I've been very critical of it. And that's the most ludicrous part of this law. What's been the effect of the law in the last 2.5 months since it was implemented? Well, we've seen already some arrests. We've seen the arrests of Jimmy Lai, one of Hong Kong's most prominent entrepreneurs, and the owner of the Apple Daily newspaper, Agnes Chow, who I mentioned earlier, a number of others. We've seen a raid by 200 police on the Apple Daily newsroom. And we've seen, really as a sign of desperation, an attempt by 12 young people who had been arrested and released on bail to flee Hong Kong in a very ramshackle boat in the hope of trying to escape to Taiwan. And tragically, they were arrested by the Chinese maritime police and are now in detention in mainland China. And their fate is unknown, but it's pretty desperate. We've also seen, as I mentioned earlier, Nathan Law, one of the most high-profile activists, flee Hong Kong and come to the UK in exile. And an estimated 100, maybe more than 100 by now, but around 100 former activists, protesters, now in the UK and in some other places in the world, having to flee for their safety. Let me close by just addressing two final aspects of this: the international response, and then finally, why does this matter? In terms of the international response, there's been a lot of very strong statements and rhetoric, which is always welcome. The action has been, the actions that have been taken are welcome, but there's a need to do a lot more. So the British government responded initially with actually a surprisingly generous and creative offer to provide a path to citizenship in this country for Hong Kongers who hold British national overseas passport status. And there are up to 3 million who are eligible for British national overseas status. And the UK has opened the potential of its doors to them, which is very welcome. And it's also suspended its extradition arrangements with Hong Kong. So thankfully, even though I'm in breach of Hong Kong's national security law regularly, it's unlikely now that I could be extradited to Hong Kong. And more seriously, it's unlikely that any Hong Konger here could be. The United States has imposed some targeted sanctions, and other countries have suspended their extradition agreements. But I think going forward, there are 3 steps that the international community could take, a 3-pronged approach. I think the international community, as far as possible, needs to act as one, because piecemeal responses are less effective than a coordinated global response. And so I think a global response should firstly be punitive. It should apply targeted sanctions, not sanctions against China as a country or Hong Kong or the people of China or Hong Kong, but targeted Magnitsky-style sanctions against officials in the Chinese and Hong Kong governments. Secondly, a diplomatic approach through the United Nations. There have been growing calls for the establishment of a UN mechanism, both specifically on Hong Kong, either a special envoy or a special rapporteur, but also a wider mechanism for human rights in China as a whole. And that's been called for by over 50 current serving UN special rapporteurs, a number of former UN special rapporteurs, including the former head of the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. And so that's something to press for. And then thirdly, a humanitarian response coordinated among like-minded countries to provide what we call a lifeboat rescue package for those Hong Kongers who are not BNOs. The British government's offer, which, as I say, is very generous, but it is only currently for BNO status holders. But there are many of the most vulnerable young activists who were born after 1997 are not eligible for BNO status. And so a coordinated program among like-minded governments to provide them with a path to sanctuary if they need it should be in place. And I close by asking the question, why does all of this matter? And I say, I think there are 3 reasons why it matters. The first is that there has been a clear breach of an international treaty, and that this represents a serious threat to the international rules-based order. Now, it's a somewhat topical moment to be talking about that, given our own situation in this country. I have to admit that what the government here is talking about doesn't exactly help me make this case. But nevertheless, I think we should make the case that that China is in breach of this treaty. Secondly, it's important because it effectively is destroying one of the world's most significant international financial centers and what has been until recently one of Asia's most open cities. And that should be of concern to all of us. What's happened is undermining everything that makes Hong Kong successful: the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, basic freedoms, and its autonomy. And thirdly, I would argue that Hong Kong is the new front line of freedom against tyranny. And if the Chinese regime is allowed to get away with what they've done to Hong Kong in the last few months, with impunity and with no consequence and with no meaningful challenge from the international community, then I'm sure that it's not going to stop there. Taiwan will be next in its sights, and beyond Taiwan, our own freedoms will be impacted as well. I have a small taste of the Chinese Communist Party regime's treatment of critics in two ways. In October 2017, I tried to visit Hong Kong. I'd been back quite a few times after I left in 2002, but my latest visit was supposed to be in 2017. And I found I was denied entry to Hong Kong on the orders of Beijing, and turned away and sent back to the UK, which at the time actually became quite a significant incident. It drew a lot of media and political attention and helped to highlight the already apparent erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms and autonomy. Obviously, the situation, as I've described, has become far, far worse since then, and many other foreign activists have been denied entry since my own case. The executive director of Human Rights Watch, the Asia editor of the Financial Times, among others. But I think I was the first Western activist to be denied entry, and that was my taste of the regime at that time. But I've also been the recipient of a campaign of harassment from the regime, which has included an extraordinary number of anonymous letters being sent to my private home address, which is not readily publicly available, but also letters that have gone to my neighbours in the street where I live in London, a number of letters that have gone to my mother, who lives in a different part of the UK, telling her to tell me to stop doing what I'm doing, and also a number of efforts to lobby British members of Parliament to tell me to shut up. And those actions don't bother me. In fact, if anything, they motivate me to do even more, because I see them in a very small way as a direct threat, not to me personally, but to our freedoms and way of life. And I think it's in all our interests to stand up for those freedoms for the people in Hong Kong, but also ultimately for ourselves as well. And so, although the Chinese Communist Party has sent various letters asking people to tell me to shut up, and from your point of view at this very moment, I will now shut up. As far as Hong Kong and human rights in China are concerned, I never will. So I look forward to your questions, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ben. I think this is a really fascinating presentation. I'm the co-chair with Regina, and you've really traced carefully how the erosion of liberties in Hong Kong has eroded over time, and